of the nature of God, which we kind of looked at, and then we kind of went away and come back. And we're talking about the wrath of God as part of His character. And it's kind of something that maybe a lot of folks don't want to talk about, but it isn't part of the nature of God. And so if you have your lesson sheets, grab those out. You're going to need them tonight. And if you don't have a set and want a set, I think there was still a handful back there on the table because I printed some more this past week. But you'll need them tonight in particular because when I brought the computer up here, it must have got bumped on inside my bag, and so I can't turn the screen on. And so I can't show it to you on the screen. Now, 40 of you go back there, then we're in trouble. Because I know there wasn't 40 copies back there. There's like 4. So hopefully that's enough to give everybody at least one to look at close by. And as we deal with this subject matter, and we introduced it a week ago, Wednesday, or a week ago from today, and we talked about the idea that we need to appreciate the fact that this is real, and that God had real wrath and anger, and it was always, generally speaking, connected to what? Well, one word. Sin, right? It was generally connected to sin. Somebody's behavior that went further and further and further into transgression beyond what God desired, and finally God reaches a point where His patience and long-suffering runs out and He deals with it. And you see that throughout various moments in time within the different narratives. And we talked about it from various aspects last Wednesday night, and we talked about how it's just and fair. There on page 104, we talked about how He chastens those that He what? He chastens those that He loves. Like a parent to a child. A parent wants the child to behave and act accordingly, and so they at times must chasten that child in order to get those kinds of results. You can't just assume it's going to happen. Can't just hope that it's going to happen. There has to be a level of discipline and even chastening. And we even talked for probably 10 or 15 minutes yet last week about the idea that that's kind of a lost characteristic among people nowadays. We don't really, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, and we don't want anybody to feel bad about themselves. And the problem we have is we're more worried about the self-esteem, so-called, than we are about folks focusing on what's right. We're more worried about not crushing what they want to believe and have within themselves, and so we even are reluctant to talk about what's right. Not just what you want or what you might feel is good, but what's actually right, and particularly what's right in the eyes of God. Because when we step outside of the realm of what God desires, then the consequence comes. And that's what this whole lesson's about. And God has proven Himself that ultimately the long-suffering runs out and He deals with it. And so that is also the case as it regards these things. You notice we didn't quite talk about it, but notice Proverbs 13:24 when we talk about the idea of proper discipline, even of children, is an act of love. If done appropriately, if done in as much fairness as human frailty can create, then it's something that's absolutely necessary. And I think that maybe a part of this problem is that we have almost gotten to the point where we have labeled all acts of discipline as abuse. Abuse is real. And there are a lot of troubled children in the world because of the abuse that they experience on a regular basis. And I am not diminishing in one bit the reality of that challenge and the soberness of that and the seriousness of that and how harmful it has and the destructive nature of it. But let's not confuse the two. Not all discipline is abuse. Not all correction is out of place. Not all correction is somehow labeled as, well, you're being too harsh. At some point, some level of discipline needs to occur. So let's notice these texts for a moment. Proverbs 13:24 to begin with. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. And by the way, just food for thought, and I know that's kind of an error, right? How do we say that? Spare the rod, spoil the child. And that's, it's kind of the way we say this text. And we generally think of the rod as solely the idea of, physical or corporal type of discipline. It's not the case. The idea here is the rod of correction, the rod of discipline. And it doesn't necessarily have to translate into something that is physical. Yeah. And so here's a concept that I think we need to grasp. Now, we could talk all night long, and probably we don't have a lot of generational gap here in the room tonight, but we got some. And I suppose if we walked through the room and talk about how some of your parents dealt with discipline, and then how a little bit younger than you was dealt with, and then how a little bit younger than you was dealt with, and on down the chain, you're probably going to see variations and differences based just on when you were born and what was common in the day that you were being raised. But there is no question and no argument, I think, can be made that any time there's a lack of discipline of some type or kind, appropriate in the eyes of God, when it's lacking, problems ensue. When it's not present, difficulties arise. And it doesn't always have to be corporal or physical. And I think it's important, maybe even for us, it's particular for this particular caption of discussion, to recognize in some senses that corporal type spanking, or whatever you might want to call it, we have to be willing to admit that it may not work with every child. Some children can go through that and be completely untrained or changed by that experience. Whereas there may be some other kind of disciplinary act that might actually have an effect on them. And so if we're kind of one-sided when it comes to the manner in which we discipline as parents, or as we teach younger parents things that they can do to help discipline their children, we've got to remember that if it's not working, then it's probably needs to be changed. And the other thing that I've always tried to encourage myself, and I'm just as human as the next guy, but God always has a righteous indignation, right? When God's anger comes pouring forth, it's always based out of a righteous indignation. And because of His character, He is always just, always fair, never makes a mistake. That's not us. And if we're disciplining strictly out of an emotional anger, not a righteous indignation, not an anger that's motivated by a judgment or justice, but I'm just mad, that discipline generally doesn't work very well. And we've got to appreciate that maybe from time to time and find maybe a better way. And yes, sometimes it might be good for us to step away for a few minutes. And not forever, because prolonged can also fail in helping them recognize what it was they actually. If you're 3 weeks later and they're trying to figure out what in the world did I do? And so we've got to think about those things. Go ahead. Yeah. And so that it's been that way forever. But that's just, it's needed. Corrective discipline is needed. And it doesn't really necessarily end. In some senses, there's a particular relationship between parents and children, obviously, but that corrective discipline really doesn't end. We all at times need to be kind of reined back in. Yeah. And go ahead, Brian. I'm sorry.
When I was younger, when I was a little boy, my mother and father naturally, and I was worried about getting
Yeah.
in trouble naturally. Now, as I get to know them in Christ, I don't want discipline.
Yeah.
That natural spiritual, first natural spiritual.
Yeah. Well, and I think, Brian, too, and let's take one step further with that picture of our physical, natural parents, and then how we also get connected to them spiritually. I've often, anytime I deal with family and I talk to fathers, I always remind them that the father is the first example to children about God. He's their first picture of what it means to have a father and to have somebody in authority over them and somebody responsible for them and somebody that's caring for them. And they may not understand the concept of Jehovah at 2, 3, 4 years old, but they do understand that if the father's doing what he should be, they begin to get a very good picture of what God the Father is like as well. And so we kind of become the first picture of that, and hopefully that builds a bond that will allow for us to share in the spiritual connection as well. Add Proverb 23, verse 13. Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. And that was a very specific kind of discipline in this case. You shall beat him with a rod. Beat is a tough word for us to get our brains around, right? Because we think of abuse as soon as we see that word. That's not the word here. It's simply physical discipline. For if you shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. Maybe the proverb writer, too, is trying to emphasize to us here a little bit that, what's the alternative here? If I do nothing, then I run the risk of them never connecting themselves to Jehovah. If they never experience any kind of discipline, you can throw whichever kind you want into this mix. We can read specifically what the proverb here says. But if we never attempt to make any kind of corrective measures in relationship to our children, then the proverb is teaching us, and proverbs, by the way, are idealistic kind of pictures that God has presented to us. But he says you just make them more prone to lose their soul in the picture here. If I'm unwilling, they'll survive. Discipline's appropriate. They're going to hate it in the moment. It's not going to be pleasant for them in the moment. But the ultimate goal is to discipline them to respect my authority and my rule, if you will, so that they will also get the picture that they've got a God that they have to answer to as well. And ultimately, that's the end purpose that we should have in mind. And then in chapter 29 and verse 15, he said, "The rod and rebuke give wisdom, for a child left to himself brings shame to his mother." And so again, these are proverbs, and so sometimes we read these and we go, "Well, I did that," and they still rebel. Well, I don't think that within the proverbs are trying to give us some kind of idea that it's an automatic. If you do this, then children will automatically understand their responsibilities and purposes. I don't know that that's the way the Proverbs are written. They're written if you want the best opportunity to affect your children in positive ways, then discipline needs to be part of that picture. And I think from a very simplistic standpoint, that's what all of these Proverbs are saying. If you want that benefit to come out on the other side, you can't hope for that at all. If there's never any instruction, never any correction, never any discipline, how can you ever expect something positive to come out on the other side? And that seems to be the simplistic picture that he's drawn out of all these. Thoughts or questions? I'll come back. Yeah. 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 And if the discipline is intended to help the child appreciate and respect for the authority in place, and also if the parent respects the proper responsibilities that God has given us, then we will discipline in the right ways and seek that out. And so there's a mutual relationship there. He's a big boy. He'll take it. I think I got a question over here. No, it wasn't you? Oh, no, I'll try to get out of that question. uh, you know, Bonnie's going to answer the question. Yeah. 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 Well, and that's somewhat connected. Let me stab at this for a second, Mary, just and give you food for thought, because I never know what kind of question I'm going to get. And I suppose it's hard on both ends of that spectrum, right? I had a fella. I met a fella in Tennessee one time. He was probably 70-ish when he told me this, and he claimed that his mother spanked him for the first time when he was 6 months old, and he could remember it. I kind of took that with a grain of salt, right? Because we kind of know that really probably didn't happen. He may have some kind of recollection in his mind that he believes that's what happened, but so we and I'm not. Some common sense has got to take place here, right? When we begin to understand at what point certain kinds of discipline can be used on children to help mold and shape and guide them in the right direction. I have on the other end of that spectrum, I tend to believe that if it's my home and I'm the authoritative figure in that home, I don't care if they're 102 and I'm 103, right? I'm the authoritative figure in that home. I'll give you an example out of my own life out of that. Now, the kind of discipline used may differ, but I can remember I was living at home. Dad was still living. I'd go into a gospel meeting. I was out at Elk Fork at a gospel meeting. And after the services, I got to talking to some folks, and before the days of cell phones, and went off and was visiting with folks, and before I knew it, it's pretty near midnight before I drove back home. When I got back home, both mom and dad, and I'm 21-ish, 22 years old, and they're both sitting there looking at me when I walked in the house. And it was interesting. It kind of gets back to what Gary said a few minutes ago. Dad was upset, not that I didn't have the liberty to be out, at 21 years old, but it was about respect. And I had disrespect. I could have picked up somebody's house phone and made a call back to Payton City and tell them. And for him, that's what it was about. You're living in my house, and your mother's going to be concerned about you all her life. And so, as a matter of respect, you owed us a phone call. And how he disciplined me wasn't necessarily anything in particular. He didn't take me over his knee, right? That got quite an awkward situation. But it was the fact that I had put them through that night. And I felt bad. That was the corrective discipline. And I still, to this day, and you could ask Deborah, I speak to my grown boys who come home and are in our house, and they're adults. And I don't necessarily put a curfew on them, and we've got technology that helps nowadays. But they know, I want to know. Now, when you're in Morgantown, you're adults, and you're going to make your choices and decisions, and I'm not tracking you, and I'm not. But when you're in my house, then we're back to Dad's rules. And so I think there is a measure of that. That within my own house, I have a right to expect certain things. And as the authoritative figure in that home. But the manner in which I would discipline my 21-year-old obviously is going to be different than, no more IHOP for him. That's kind of what that is. But anyway, it's different. But I think your house is your house.
How does this discipline affect the church?
Well, we got enough time for that, Jim. Jim, obviously, that we could talk anecdotally for hours about how elderships have paid the price, if you will, with undisciplined children, because undisciplined children become undisciplined at times members of the Lord's body. And in the minute you try to say anything corrective, and you get backlash because of that. And so it is challenging. And I've always said, Jim, I firmly believe this. There's not a thing that happens in the world or in the home that doesn't eventually have to be dealt with within the Lord's body. It's just fact that if it happens in the world and it happens in the home, it's going to be something that you're going to have to address in the Lord's body as well, because that's the way Satan works. He wants anything that he can get that's a problem out there to affect the body in here. And so we're going to be dealing with, and we do. I think the church does deal. And it's hard. And because there's a level of judgment in all this, right? Mary, back to your question for half a second. The Bible doesn't say. The Bible doesn't say start, this kind of discipline at 3 years old and start this kind at 10 years old and stop this kind at 18 years old. It doesn't say. And so I've got to take these principles that he shares with me and apply human judgment to the principles that God has given and do the best I can. I think that's kind of why he says we accepted the frail human discipline of our earthly fathers. How much more should we not accept the pure, perfect discipline and chastening that comes from God the Father? God even recognizes that we're going to make mistakes. And we're going to discipline in the wrong way sometimes, and in the wrong types of things, and we're going to get the wrong child if you got more than one. We're going to have those moments because we're the human side of that. But we still have to do the best we can to apply human judgment within the principles that God has given us, because He just simply doesn't. And again, these are proverbs, and from an authoritative perspective, they're part of the Old Testament covenant. But they're educational in terms of helping us get a little bit of a picture of the importance of discipline. Yeah. And if you want to exist within the kingdom, then here's the conduct of the citizens of my kingdom. And he'll try to chasten and rebuke and reprove and exhort in order to keep us within the rules and guidelines that God's provided. Go ahead, Brian.
Before I ask my question, I need to ask you a question.
Okay.
This is speaking Old Testament.
Gotcha.
Okay. The first thing that came, and I'm speaking, I'm not the father.
Right.
The scriptures say that I'm supposed to leave and cleave to my wife.
Yeah.
And at that point, now my question is, in Old Testament, especially with Israel, up until that point, did they live in the same household? Even maybe in their 20s or something. I know, that's my question.
Yeah.
Because under that, because even if they were 20-some years old, it's still living at home until they got married, separated from that.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that pops up in my mind.
And I think that, and I do agree that there is a transitional difference. And you probably did. I think sometimes we see leave and cleave, and in our minds we think you've got to move at least X amount of miles. And that's not really the principle, because you're absolutely right. Culturally, they absolutely lived as families. And you might have many generational families that are interconnected within certain residences. And so you can see that happening. And so leave and cleave's got to mean something slightly different than just get away. And I think what it is you've started a new family entity. And once you've left the authoritative mindset of this entity, and you've created your own new. And you're gonna leave father and mother and cleave to you're no longer dependent within this structure, but creating a new dependency upon each other. And I think we can make the mistake sometimes of getting the idea that somehow, well, let me get back to it. In the light of this thought, or this caption, so you're not necessarily going to be under the same kind of authority just because you're under the same roof. And I think that gets back to the idea of the respect that I would have. Honor your father and mother never went away. I think sometimes we forget that. The command said, honor thy father and thy mother. Not honor thy father and thy mother till you're 18, or till you have your own family, or until it's just honor your father and your mother. And so there's multiple kinds of layers, I guess you might be able to recognize in all these things. Yeah. Right. You've got to leave and you've got to create this, whatever the proximity is. Go ahead, Jeff. Yeah. I'm not. I'm. Yeah, no, it is amazing though, and so she, in some senses, from illustration standpoint, that's too far. She disallowed, and he should have found a different way, right, to leave. Or maybe both sleep on the porch or whatever. I don't know, but okay, yeah, and I never even thought about it from that angle. Yeah, I never even thought about it from that. But yeah, I mean, you can appreciate that, I guess. Yeah, boy, I tell you. I get you, man. I tell you, every time I think I've heard it all, I hear something like that, and I go, "Wow!" Put that in my book. Go ahead, Bon. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure there's very sobering nature about the Old Testament law and its relationship to what extent discipline could reach, and maybe in some senses, if you had the fear of that, then maybe you would act a little better. If you knew the consequences could be that severe under that law, and I'm not saying we bring in that law back, and anyway, we could talk about that in length in some ways about can we figure out reasons why God would have done such a thing, but anyway, I mean, it's amazing when you think about how drastic that discipline could have been. Yeah. It's not. We do get the wrong images. Right. We do get the wrong images sometimes that we're talking about a toddler who still learning the difference between his left and his right hand. And I think you're right. We have to be careful that we get the right images from the fullness of those descriptions sometimes. Yeah. You don't quit trying to guide and lead. I think even the scriptures would say older women teach the younger women how to love their husbands. Well, that's obviously somebody who's already married, because he's telling you, teach you how to do these things. And so there's there's obviously a continued connection between parent and child, and the discipline may change in its technique, but the corrective help doesn't necessarily ever really go away.
One thing you got to remember, when you discipline a child, you do it in love.
Yeah, and
You
I
don't want that child.
And I think, Jim, what we in any kind of discipline, I think, if this can be kind of our summation statement, in any kind of discipline, we have to ask, what is the end? What am I trying to do here? What is it? What behavior am I trying to correct? What path am I trying to lead them to? What guidance? What is the purpose? And that gets back to what I said earlier. If the purpose is I'm mad and I'm going to lash out one way or another, then go dunk your head in a cold bath or something for a minute and calm down, because that I'm mad and somebody's going to pay the price is not a disciplined purpose. And when love's the motivator, I'll look at and evaluate this situation and say, what am I trying to achieve? What's the best kind of instruction, discipline, correction that needs to be issued in order to get there? All right, let's move on. And it kind of ties to what I just finished with. Because though God has anger, how long does it usually take Him to get there? And generally speaking, it takes quite a while, right? He is slow to anger. Let's look at the psalm, the passages in Psalm 103 to start with in verse 8. Where the psalmist simply says, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in mercy. I think from that one text we can kind of get a grasp of how God governs His own nature when it comes to His anger. What's God's preference to give? If you just read that verse, what's His preference? Mercy. Mercy's His preference. He would prefer to extend mercy. What's mercy, by the way, by definition? Yeah, it's part of that unmerited favor in grace, but it's grace. We kind of look at grace as a gift I didn't earn, and mercy as discipline that was withheld. I received mercy, discipline withheld, and so God's preference is to not respond in anger. His preference is to extend mercy. If that's the nature of God, then whose nature should it also be? It should be mine. What's my preference when it comes to situations? Do I give deference to mercy, or do I prefer to jump straight to the reactionary discipline? And that's kind of what we have to consider sometimes. God says He was slow to anger and abounding in mercy. He was merciful and gracious, both withholding corrective things and extending the unmerited favor in the same moment. That's His preference. Doesn't mean His wrath doesn't exist. Doesn't mean He won't bring consequence. Doesn't mean that He hasn't. It just means that's His preference. We've got to find a balance. God's found a balance. He's, over the years and centuries of man's existence, God has found a balance between extending mercy and compassion and grace, and moments where He has to finally builds to a point. He's been slow to get there, but He finally does get there. And the rod of correction has to come. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. And when you think about this, look for a moment to that, and it's in your outlines themselves. Joel 2 verse 13. He says, "So rend your heart and not your garments." Well, there's about 1 billion sermons, right, Jeff? Yeah. Well, you can preach out of that statement right there. Rend your heart, not your garments. Don't give me some superficial reaction. I want your heart. When you've misbehaved, rend your heart, not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for He is gracious and merciful and slow to anger and of great kindness, and He relents. Here's the essential. And He relents from doing harm. Part of God's character and nature is this judgment and wrath and anger that can come forth, but He also says He can relent. What caused Him to relent? According to Joel 2:13. When they did what? Well, that's what caused the problem, but how does He get them to find, how do they find mercy? When they rend their hearts. Yeah. Legitimately feeling bad about what you've done. A desire to correct what you've done. Yeah. And so when that happens, you can withhold, in a sense, the anger and wrath that God may have otherwise brought. And the implication of that too is because He's slow to anger, He's even given you enough time to figure that out. And sometimes we kind of don't appreciate that as much as we should. God, within His justice, could just bring immediate consequence to everything we did, and there wouldn't be very many of us left, right? But He says, I get there over a period of time, and while that's happening, and while I'm being slow to anger, then you've got opportunities to rend your hearts and show some penitence and change your thought processes and change your behaviors. And if the world's still spinning and we're still breathing, there's opportunity to kind of get off the wrong track and get back on the path that God was up. Yeah. Well, I mean, He's long-suffering, to the point of allowing the earth to continue, willing that everyone should repent. Yeah. And so if He's still given time, then He's still being slow to His anger and judgment that'll ultimately come. And what's nice about it too is, from Micah's standpoint in Micah 7, when he talks about how He does not retain His anger forever, for He delights in mercy. Ask you something real, just food for thought, and you don't have to answer out loud, obviously. But do you let things go quickly, or are you one of those kind of folks that kind of once you've reached the fever pitch, once I've reached this moment, I kind of stay here for a while? It's good for us to not stay angry forever. So number one, God's slow, right? Yeah. Yeah. And so it's addressed, and then He's willing to step back from that. He doesn't stay angry forever. I don't know whether I've ever shared this anecdote with you or not, but when I was a kid, I can remember this, and this is this. Now, I wasn't 6 months old, but I was, 7 or 8 years, and I can remember. I don't have any idea what I did, but I'm sure Jill caused it. But I got disciplined pretty good, and I was laying in my bed and feeling sorry for myself, more so because I couldn't be outside playing ball or whatever than the discipline correction that I just received. But at any rate, I'm laying there, and Mom brought a box fan into the bedroom. Now keep in mind, that was days before central air conditioning. We had one air conditioner in the entire house, and it was the living room. Living room was like an iceberg. Everything else was just as hot as outside. Because we weren't allowed to leave the bedroom doors open. Remember those days? when you wanted 2 rooms cool, and so you had a window unit and every other door was shut, and it was like a sauna. But she brought that box fan in there. And I've never forgot that, because what was her way of saying, I'm not angry with you anymore. I was pretty upset with you 20 minutes ago, but I'm not angry with you. And her mercy was starting to already be shown. I was still in my bedroom and wasn't allowed outside yet. But it felt a lot better with that box fan going. It was a little more comfortable knowing that the discipline was behind me. And that I could enjoy the mercy and grace of my mother again. That's God. Sometimes the discipline has to come. Sometimes the correction has to come. Sometimes, as parents, the correction has to come. But don't stay there. The mercy can return, especially when we see the repentance and the penitence and relationship to God, when we see those hearts being rendered. Yeah. Yeah. And so, just as God was slow to anger, we learn from Him. And we appreciate that our disposition should be to be slow to anger as well. In fact, that's the challenge in James 1, right? Verses 19 and 20. Therefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Wow. 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 You think about what he just said. The wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. You know, I think sometimes we get in our minds that I'm ruling with an iron fist because that's what God would want from me. Maybe not. Maybe God's character, even within His wrath, is slightly different than that. And that God would want me to be more like Him. And recognize that my human wrath and the failures and frailties that often accompany that human wrath doesn't really produce the righteousness that God is looking for. If God is slow to anger, then I better be even a little slower to anger, right? If God is slow to anger and is long-suffering and gives space and time for penitence and change, and then I'm human and prone to make mistakes, and so I better even go a little further than God does in order to make sure my human frailties don't step in the way. And the truth is that sometimes the anger gets in the way of the discipline, if you can understand what I'm trying to say. If the discipline is intended to make a correction or to guide or to give some kind of help to get somebody on the right path or on making the right decisions or better decisions, sometimes the anger just produces rebellion and doesn't give me the opportunity to actually give the education and the learning and the corrective path that I'm actually trying to achieve. Now again, corrective measures have to be used. We looked at those in the Proverbs. And we have to reach a point sometime where we can't always just say, well, I'm being slow to wrath. Well, it's been 3 years and you've never said to your child no ever. Right? And then we wonder. We've got to be careful that we don't but we want to lend ourselves to being patient and long-suffering. And careful that we don't let the anger supersede the corrective discipline that really needs to take place. Because at the end of the day, again, friends, it's not about I'm mad. It's about what you did was not right. And we've got to figure out a way to help you know that you shouldn't do that again. And there's all kinds of ways to let that happen. And I would hope that education would be a desire that we would have to offer. Now, don't misunderstand me. I was just like a lot of other people. I mean, You can sit in that pew right there. I mean, my dad sitting in a pew and see you getting out of hand in the pew, he could knock you out with a flick of his finger. I mean, right? He gets your attention like that. And I survived. I'm standing here. And it taught me pretty quick to recognize there were certain things that were appropriate and certain things that weren't. And I could think back to all kinds of things that corrective measures of various types and kinds that were intended to educate. Let me know that behavior is unacceptable. That choice or that decision or what you just said is unacceptable. And along the path, teach me why. Not just, you can't do that, but teach me why. Help me understand that. Help me appreciate why my behavior doesn't fit either our home rules or God's rules or whose ever. And I think it's sometimes just easier for us to just deal out the discipline, right? It's easier. Just deal it out. Maybe a conversation needs to take place. And education needs to take place. What did God do while He was being slow to anger? He sent prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet. Messenger after messenger. Trying to educate, trying to help, trying to guide, trying to lead the people to make changes. We're not perfect. None of us will be. And we can all look back at those experiences that we've had if we've had children and as parents where we just go, that wasn't the best thing I ever did as a parent. I'm not talking about perfection here, but we can grow and we can change if need be. Any thoughts or questions about any of that? Cause. Yeah.
But on the flip side of that, John 15:25, but this comes to pass, the word might be fulfilled as written in the law, they hated me.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it's important for us, again, in kind of thinking about all these things, is to ask ourselves, what is the cause? What's the circumstance? And then what's the purpose? What's the end result that I'm looking for here? And none of this that we talked about tonight is an attempt to try to embarrass or make anybody feel bad. It's just an effort to maybe help us to be able to maybe help, it'd be a good idea. If I made mistakes, to talk to a younger father or talk to a younger mother and say, I didn't do everything right, and here's some things that I did that probably didn't work like they should have, and I would encourage you not to do that. It's not an idea of trying to make us feel horrible about ourselves. It's the idea of what can we learn from our own failures to be able to help somebody else with maybe. We'll come back.